and welcome back to FTC Team 16953's CAD YouTube tutorial videos on Fusion 360 presented by Autodesk. My name is Brian Simmel. I'm the head of CAD here on the American side of Fireteam. In our last video, we went over the layout of Fusion 360 and how to move about the interface. If you have not yet seen that video, I encourage you to go rewatch that for your own edification. In today's lesson, we're going to discuss 2D drawings and getting started with designing objects in Fusion 360. Let's get started. Alright, welcome to the Fusion 360 workspace. Let's get right into it. So what you're going to notice right now is that we're in the solid ribbon, and in the solid ribbon we have some folders, some sections that Fusion 360 has separated to keep us organized, like the Create folder, the Modify folder, Assemble, Construct, Inspect, Insert, Select, so on and so forth. But at closer inspection, what you're going to notice is that a lot of these instructions, a lot of these commands are based off of three-dimensional shapes like cubes, cylinders, torus shapes. And what I find in CAD is that often we create a sketch, a two-dimensional drawing, design, and then from that design, from that drawing, we're going to extrude a three-dimensional shape so we can start working with our solid create and modify commands, like for example revolve, sweep, and when we get into the modify section we're going to be chamfering, filleting, splitting, and joining bodies. But in order for us to have that solid object, first we need to create that drawing so we can extrude. So whether that be going to your create dropdown and hitting the second command, or just hitting on the create sketch quick key, start a create sketch command. When you do so, you're going to be prompted with three different planes, whether that be the XY plane, the XZ plane, and the YZ plane. And these planes correspond with the views and the viewports that we discussed in the previous video. So for example, the XY plane is in reference to the front view, the XZ plane is going to be that top-down view, and the YZ plane is going to be your right side view. And these are always arbitrary because we can fix or change the views like we'd gone over in a previous video. I prefer to usually pick by default XZ plane, and so I'm always looking at the top down of my drawing. And now welcome to the sketch space. So if you notice, we're no longer in that solid ribbon, we're in a sketch ribbon, the ribbon that's independent for our drawings. And similar to the solid ribbon, we have a create folder, a modify, inspect, insert, select. However, we have this new one, constraint, which is specific to the sketch, the 2D drawing folder, and allows us to constrict our drawing with parameters, which allows for ease and access when drawing and creating our two-dimensional shape. Okay, so most of your sketch tools for drawing your shapes are going to be located in the create dropdown in the sketch ribbon. So things like line, rectangle, circle, arc, and polygon, they're more or less the same with little to few exceptions. And we're not going to go over each individual command because they're fairly self-explanatory. A rectangle draws a rectangle, a circle draws a circle. But instead we're going to go over how to use them and when to use them. So for example, I'm going to start using the rectangle tool for my example, and once I've initiated the rectangle command, I'm still able to move my cursor. This is because most CAD softwares use what I like to call a 2 to 3 click function, click command. So this being said, after I've started using the rectangle function, until I use my mouse and left click, I will not draw any shapes. This allows me to orient myself and find my cursor in a place I would like. I'm going to start arbitrarily at the origin. I'm going to click on my mouse and my left click, and left mouse click, and now I've started my drawing. So now when I move my cursor, move my mouse, I'm able to extend my rectangle and draw the rectangle. On that second click, I'm going to finalize my drawing, and I'll know that it's a full shape when my coloring, my interior coloring, is blue. We'll get into a little bit more of open and closed shapes in a second, but the reason why I like to call it a 2-3 click step method is because depending on the shape, depending on what you're trying to draw, you're going to need more than 2 clicks. For example, in the arc, you have 2 different dimensions that are independent of each other. So I'm going to use the 3-point arc. My starting click is going to start my drawing. My second click is going to give me the dimension. I'm going to have it set to 25 millimeters in length. And I'm going to have now the radius of my arc. My arc radius and its length are independent of each other. So you need to have two different dimensions and therefore need two clicks. When I just did my 2-point rectangle, I had my first click and then my second click. My second click was the diagonal of the rectangle, and from the diagonal, the computer was able to associate it with a length and a width with Pythagorean's theorem. Anytime you're in a command and you like to exit using the function, you can either click on a new one or just hit the escape key. What you're going to notice is that my rectangle is a closed shape, while my arc is not. It's denoted by having a blue tint in the area. This allows you to differentiate between a solid shape and an open shape, and each has its own variant and its own pros and cons. And we'll get into why you would want to have an open shape versus a closed shape later on. However, when you're using the line tool, we have an exception to the 2-3 click rule that I had mentioned previously. I'm going to go ahead and start my first click, my starting click, and I'm going to draw out my line to, let's say, 36 millimeters. I'm going to do my second click, finishing my line. What you're going to notice is that I haven't clicked, after I've done my second click, I haven't clicked to start my line again. But because Fusion encourages you to make a closed shape, it's going to allow you to continue drawing instead of having to re-click. And this happens and occurs in other CAD softwares like SolidWorks and Inventor, because when you have a closed shape, you can do commands on it. You can extrude it to have a 3-dimensional solid shape. You can modify a shape so you can start working with fillets and chamfers, but you can't do that with an open shape because it doesn't have an area to extrude. You would want to use the open shape when working with construction lines, and we'll get into that later on. With the line tool, however, if you don't want to finish drawing a shape, if you want to keep it open, you can either press the escape key like we had mentioned previously, or you can hover over the check mark and it's going to turn green. By clicking on the check mark, you're going to be escape from that drawing of the shape, and then all you have to do is escape the line function. When drawing your shapes, when drawing your 2-dimensional sketches, we have the ability to dimension our sketches to be precise, whether that be during drawing the shape or after the fact. And I'm going to show you an example of both. I'm going to use my shortcut R to get the 2-point rectangle, and I'm going to start with a very simple, my 2-3 click method. I'm going to start with my first click, and I'm going to start expanding my rectangle. I haven't done my second click yet because I'm not going to. Notice that on the left there's a highlighted length of 35 millimeters. This is our dimension. This is our length that allows us to specifically key in our value. So let's say our value wasn't an even number, or an integer. Let's say it was 30.15874. That's not going to be at the intersection of two grids, so it's not going to be a snap. So we'd have to key that in, and we wouldn't be able to get it otherwise. Notice that when I do so, we get this yellow lock next to my value that allows me to know that that is a parameter, a dimension that I've set, and it will be constricted to that length, so I don't have to worry about me losing my length. I can move my cursor up and down, but the length stays the same. If I want to go to my second dimension, and most drawing tools that you'll use have at least 2 dimensions, whether that be a length and a width, an arc and a length, a radius, that's it. You might need to switch between 2 different dimensions. So switching between the two during the drawing, all you have to do is go to your keyboard and hit the tab key, which will allow you to turn to the second dimension. I'm going to want this to be, let's say, 60 millimeters. In doing so, I have now constricted my rectangle to be 30 and somewhat millimeters by 60 millimeters. But let's just say that now looking at my rectangle, I realize that I don't want my length to be 30 point something, I want it to be 32. Instead of having to restart my drawing, all I do is, like we had switched over to our second dimension, we're going to hit the tab key, switch back to the first and hit the escape key. Notice that when I hit the escape key, the lock disappears, allowing me to now either re-enter a value or manually move it to wherever I'd like it to be. I'm gonna set it to be 31 millimeters. I'm gonna go ahead and click enter, and now I've created a solid shape. Notice that when we manually input our dimensions, we have our dimension lines that we would write when we're drawing it by hand come up to the sides, and we can move these as far away or as close as we want to our body. We can move it to the other side, and so on and so forth. If you want to redimension your object, your shape after the fact, you can either go to the dimension tool, the sketch dimension, or press your shortcut. By default it's D, and click on the edge, hover over, click on the edge, find the dimension, single click to place your dimension, and then you can type in your dimension that you desire. However, if you have a preset dimension and you're not in the dimension tool, you can just double click on the dimension, which will allow you to enter a value. And so you don't have to constantly be switching from dimension tool out, as long as the dimension is already there. If you want to delete the dimension in terms of viewing it, just click on the dimension once and then use the delete key to get rid of it. When you are working with shapes and sketches, it's better to be efficient in any way possible. So for example, in an example, I'm going to start with a two-dimensional 2-point rectangle. I'm going to draw a 100 millimeter by 100 millimeter square. Within the square, let's say I wanted to create 100 smaller squares with a dimension of 10 millimeters, 5 millimeters by 5 millimeters. And I wanted to create 100 of these. Well, yes, I could find this, calculate the spacing between each of the my squares and having to do the math for that, and it would work, but it would take a long time. So Fusion, as well as other CAD softwares, has patterns that allow us to make sort of shortcuts. So for example, I'm going to exit my 2-point rectangle, go down to my create dropdown, and go over to my rectangle pattern. The rectangle pattern allows you to create a rectangular pattern based off of one shape in 2 dimensions. So I'm going to click on the rectangle pattern, and now I've started. I'm prompted with a couple instructions. First, I need to highlight my object. Then I need to specify what directions and distance and type. So let's just start with just my object. I'm going to hover over from the top left corner, hold down on my mouse, left mouse, and drag out an area and highlight the full area of my square. When you're using the left to down highlight, you have to highlight the entire face in order to highlight and activate it. If you're going to do for example, right up, it doesn't matter what's inside the highlight area. If the full shape isn't there or not, it's going to highlight the entire face. So there's a difference if you want to be more precise or you want to get everything encompassed. So I'm going to go back to my rectangle pattern, go from my left down, and I've created my object. I have my edges and my vertices. Now I want to specify a direction. I can either manually click on direction and then key in the distance, or I can just hover over the arrow, click down, and stretch it. Now currently I have only three squares. I can easily change this by keying in my value. Let's say I want to have 10 squares, and the rectangle pattern is going to do the math and evenly space each of the squares so that it's equal between each of them. Now I've just created 10 squares that are identical in every way without having to redraw each square. Now if I want to have 10 columns, now I want to make 10 rows. Very simply, I'm going to click on this up arrow and drag it down. You notice I still have my 3 rows. This is just the default that Fusion picks. I can easily just set it to 10, and it will populate my square. So now I have 100 squares that are evenly spaced, all the same length and width, in a mere matter of seconds instead of what would have taken minutes. Entering it, I've now created 100 squares that I can work with individually or as a whole. Now, let's say I wanted to just highlight the white space, so not the actual squares. All I have to do is go from my bottom up click, like I had mentioned previously, and it'll highlight everything except that's inside that highlighting box. Currently, if I were to highlight, let's say, the edge of my larger box square and the edge of my smaller square, both would be highlighted. If I want to highlight multiple things at once, I just have to click the control key and click on the faces, and it'll allow me to highlight them individually. This was the rectangle pattern, and let's say we want to make a circle pattern. I'm going to make another 100 by 100 millimeter square, and I'm going to work with a circle tool for now. I'm going to use my shortcut C. I'm going to make a circle arbitrarily 20 millimeters. Now, when you notice that when you make a circle, you're going to automatically have a center point. Now, if I want to make a circle pattern, you're going to notice that I'm going to need my objects, just like in the rectangle pattern, but also a center point. However, in a rectangle, there isn't a center point. It's a rectangle. You have your edges, but not a center point. If you were working with a circle, you would have that center point. So how could we create that? How could we go about creating that? That's very simple. So I'm going to quickly exit out of my circle pattern, and we're going to introduce what's called the point. The point is exactly what it sounds like. It allows you to set points manually, so you have places to drag from. When I have activated my point, I'm going to go to my edge, and notice that when I'm on the edge and I'm not at one of the intersections of my grid, I have an X, and that just denotes that I'm on the edge of my face, of my two-dimensional shape. When I'm at the intersection of one of my of a grid as well as on my face, you're gonna get a box with an X. When I'm on the corner, on the vertex of my shape, all I'm gonna have is just a normal square. Now notice when I get to the center of my square, I'm gonna have my point, my X, as well as this triangle. Anytime you're working with, whether that be on paper or in CAD, a triangle denotes the midpoint. This allows you to reference the midpoint and know that this is an axis of symmetry right here. Notice that I get a blue construction line, a blue dotted line that will allow me to reference this as my midpoint. Now I found the midpoint of my length, but now I need to find out my width. And yes, I could count the boxes, or I could do the same method, where I'm gonna slide my cursor down the edge and wait to get my triangle, knowing that this is the midpoint. From here, I'm gonna drag it out without clicking. I'm going to drag my mouse from the edge, and it's going to intersect. It's gonna show me the intersection of my midpoint up here and the midpoint here. And I'm gonna click on this, knowing that this is my center point. And I've now created the center to now I can use for my circle pattern. So I'm gonna escape my point key, or my point function rather, go to my circle pattern, and now just fill in everything it asks for. So it needs my objects. I'm going to circle and highlight all the objects, both the perimeter, the circumference, as well as the center point. And when it refers to the center point to revolve around, I'm gonna do this external point. Anytime I ask for a center point, you want something external to the bodies. Anytime you use a circle pattern or a square pattern, or a rectangular pattern, you're going to always want to extrude both when it comes to circles. The perimeter, as well as any edges or center points of that object. This allows you to then work with each individual object and entity instead of having to recalculate and replace the point. So now that I've selected my point, I'm going to be defaultly, like I said, prompted with 3 circles that are evenly spaced, just like the rectangle pattern. Now, when we have, let's say, two circles, it would be easy to just find the dimension between my center point as well as my edge, and do the same calculation on the bottom. However, let's say we have more than just four, more than two circles. What happens then? Yes, we can do the math and figure out what's the distance between, how to calculate the distance between each of these circles to the edge. But that's going to get into some math that is going to take too long. We can do it in a far simpler way like I just showed. And notice that when I have all my circles, they're going to be all evenly spaced. This brings us to our last quote-unquote pattern tool, and that's going to be the mirror. The mirror allows us to take an object and mirror it over a plane, whether that be a line that we have drawn already, or what we call a construction line. Like I mentioned previously, construction lines are open shapes or open lines that are helpful, that aren't part of the drawing. They're not real, but they're just for measurements. So if you look at your sketch palette, the construction line or construction is that first command, whether that be using the shortcut X or just clicking on your construction. You're able to draw a measuring line that's not a real object, that's not a part of your drawing, but it allows you to use as an object. So for example, I'm going to start with my line tool. I'm going to create a line with my first click and then my second click, using the escape key to leave my line tool. Then I'm going to highlight my line by clicking on it, and then either press the X shortcut key or the construction just quick button. If I want to do multiple construction lines at once, instead of drawing them all as solid real lines and then turn them into construction lines, I can just enter my construction command, and now anything I'll draw after that will be construction line. And notice that this is a solid shape, but because it's a construction line, because it's not a real object, it doesn't have that solid blue tint. Now that I have my construction line, I want to mirror my pattern and my circles and squares over that construction line. So I'm going to highlight my objects from the top down. I've now highlighted all of my edges, all of my center points, all of my vertices, and now I need to use the mirror line. I'm going to click on the mirror line and highlight my new construction line. It's going to mirror the line, my object, so it's equidistant from both sides. Now I've created a mirror object that is symmetrical to the other. Finally, in this video, we're going to go over the text. Text allows you to create text as solid shapes. So instead of, let's say, wanting to make an A, instead of having to manually draw out what would be a capital letter A, and as you can tell, it's not symmetrical, we're able to use the text key to create text. So I've started my text function. I'm going to first click, and I'm going to be prompted with text, height, angle, and so on and so forth. Let's just say, hello world. You can put any character from the keyboard on there, and any keyboard, whether that be an underscore, any special characters. You're able to bold, italicize, and underline your text and change its font family. You can change the height. So, for example, let's say I want to make this 15 millimeters. And if I want to change my angle, I can do so. What you can't do on the prompt is move the general location and from your pop-up box. You can do that on the actual manually, but it's not going to be precise. It's not going to be able to click to snap to grid. But on creation, on pressing OK, I've now created a solid shape that I can extrude either individual letters or as a whole.